The last thing my father said to me before the judge called the room to order was, "You should have just signed the papers when we asked nicely." He said it with a smile. That particular smile I had known my entire life, the one he used when he was absolutely certain he had already won. I was 29 years old, standing at the respondent's table in a courtroom in downtown Toronto, wearing a blazer I had bought secondhand from a value village on Bloor Street because I could not afford anything better. My hands were steady. I made sure of that, but my chest felt like someone had wrapped a fist around my ribs and was slowly tightening their grip. My father sat across the room with his legal team, 3 lawyers from a Bay Street firm that charged more per hour than I made in a week. His wife, the woman he had left my mother for 14 years ago, sat in the gallery behind him in a camel coat that probably cost $3,000. She was watching me the way you watch something small and unfortunate trying to cross a busy street. I did not look at either of them for long. I had a folder on the table in front of me, and I kept my eyes on it. Inside that folder was everything, every document, every record, every piece of paper that was about to make this the last courtroom my father would ever feel comfortable walking into. He had no idea what was inside it. That was the only thing keeping me up late. I need to go back to the beginning. Not the real beginning. That would take years. But the beginning that matters here. My name is not important for what I am about to tell you. What matters is this: I am the daughter my father decided was expendable. I grew up in Oakville, Ontario, in a house that looked generous from the outside. 4 bedrooms, a 2-car garage, a backyard with a deck my father built himself one summer and talked about for 15 years afterward. We were not rich by any real definition, but we were comfortable, and comfortable in southern Ontario in the 90s meant you had enough to never quite understand what not having enough felt like. My father's name is Conrad. He built a small construction and property management company over 20 years, Harwick Properties, starting with one rental duplex in Hamilton and expanding slowly into a portfolio of commercial properties across the Greater Toronto area. By the time I was in university, Harwick had 12 employees and assets worth somewhere around $8 million. Not a dynasty, but not nothing either. My mother's name is Ruth. She worked as a dental hygienist for 31 years. She put away money carefully. She drove the same Honda Accord for 11 years. She made my lunches until I was 14 and then taught me to make my own. She is the most quietly capable person I have ever known. And my father spent the last decade of their marriage treating her like furniture. When I was 15, he left. Not dramatically, not with a fight I could point to later and say, that was it, that was the moment. He just started being home less, and then he started being home almost never, and then one evening in February he sat at the kitchen table with his coat still on and told my mother and me that he was moving out. He had already rented an apartment. He had already made arrangements. He had, it turned out, already been seeing someone else for almost 2 years. Her name was Diane. She was 41, recently divorced with no children, and a talent for making my father feel like the most interesting person in any room. He married her 3 years later. I was not invited to the wedding. My father said it was because he wanted to keep things small. I found out from my aunt that there were 64 guests. I am telling you all of this because I need you to understand the specific quality of my father's cruelty. It was never loud. It was never the kind you could show someone and have them immediately agree was wrong. It was the kind that came wrapped in reasonable explanations, in tone of voice, plausible deniability, in the faint implication that if you were hurt by it, that was probably more about your sensitivity than his behavior. He paid child support on time. He called on my birthday usually. He came to my high school graduation and took a photograph of me that I have never been able to look at without feeling something complicated. He did all the minimum things. He just never did anything more than the minimum, and he did it in a way that made it impossible to articulate why that felt like abandonment without sounding ungrateful. When I was 22, I graduated from Ryerson, Toronto Metropolitan now, with a degree in business administration. I had worked part-time through all 4 years. I had student loans. I had moved back in with my mother for a year after graduation to save money, sleeping in my childhood bedroom, listening to the radiator clank all winter, applying for jobs on my laptop at the kitchen table while my mother made tea and pretended not to watch me worry. My father called to congratulate me on my degree. He told me he was proud. Then he told me he had an opening at Harwick for a junior property coordinator and that I should send him my resume if I was interested. I sent it that night. I spent 4 years at Harwick. I want to be precise about what those 4 years were, because I have spent a lot of time since then trying to understand whether I was naive or just willing to hope for something that was never on offer. I worked harder than anyone else in that office. That is not ego. That is what every single former colleague I have spoken to since has confirmed, unprompted. I came in early. I stayed late. I learned the property management software, the tenant communication protocols, the city zoning regulations, the insurance renewal cycles. I handled the Hamilton properties almost entirely on my own by my second year. I brought in 2 new commercial clients. I flagged a contractual error in a lease renewal that would have cost my father $40,000. I was paid $38,000 a year for the first 2 years and $41,000 for the last two. I never received a performance bonus. I was never given a title above coordinator. My father told me when I asked about a promotion in my third year that he wanted to wait until he was sure I could handle more responsibility. I nodded. I went back to my desk. I handled more responsibility anyway because there was no one else to handle it. What I did not know, what I had absolutely no way of knowing, was that my father had already decided I was not part of his plan. His plan, it turned out, involved Harwick passing entirely to his stepson, Diane's son from her first marriage. His name is Brett. Brett was 26, had never worked in property management, had a commerce degree from a school in the States that I will not name here, and had spent the 3 years since graduation working on and off at a friend's landscaping company and taking snowboarding trips to Whistler. I found this out the way you find out most devastating things in families, sideways, accidentally, in a moment when someone forgot you were in the room. I was at a dinner at my father and Diane's house in Mississauga, the Christmas before everything fell apart. I had gone to the kitchen to refill a water jug and I heard my father and his accountant, a man named Douglas who had been coming to these dinners for years and who I had always vaguely trusted, talking in the hallway near the front door. My father said Brett's name. He said the word transition. He said sometime in the next 2 years. I stood very still in the kitchen with the water jug in my hand and I understood, in the particular way you understand things you have been half expecting your entire life, exactly what was happening. I went back to the table. I ate my dinner. I drove home on the 401 in the dark, and I sat in my car in the parking garage of my apartment building in Etobicoke for a long time before I could make myself go inside. The following morning, I went to work. I said nothing. I started making copies. Not of everything. I was careful. I was not stealing. Let me be clear about that. I was documenting. I made copies of every file that related to work I had personally done, every client communication I had originated, every report I had written. I kept them on a personal hard drive I stored at my mother's house. I also started keeping a log, dates, times, conversations, what was said and by whom. I did this for 8 months. Then, in September, my father called me into his office and Diane was there, which had never happened before, and Douglas, the accountant, was on the phone, and my father told me that Harwick was restructuring and that my position was being eliminated. He offered me 8 weeks of severance. He thanked me for my contributions. He said he hoped I would land somewhere that was a better fit. Diane looked at a spot just above my head for the entire conversation. She had the expression of someone attending a mildly unpleasant obligation. I took the severance agreement. I said I would need time to review it. I left the building with my personal items in a paper bag from the kitchen. Said goodbye to the colleague I was closest to, a property manager named Vivian, who whispered, "I'm sorry," in my ear and held on a second longer than necessary. And I went to my car and drove home and did not cry until I was inside with the door locked behind me. I cried for about an hour, and then I called a lawyer. Her name is Anaya. She is employment and civil litigation lawyer with an office in North York, and she was recommended to me by my mother's friend, whose daughter had used her in a wrongful dismissal case 3 years earlier. I had actually found Anaya's number 6 months before any of this happened and saved it in my phone under a fake contact name just in case. That is the kind of person I had become by then. Anaya listened to everything I told her. She looked at the severance offer. She looked at the documentation I had been keeping. She was quiet for a long moment and then she said, "This is more than a wrongful dismissal case." She was right. What Anaya found, once we started pulling records, was a pattern that went beyond my termination. Over the previous 18 months, a series of property transfers within the Harwick portfolio had been structured in a way that systematically moved assets into a numbered holding company, one that my father was a director of, and that Brett had been quietly added to as a co-director 8 months earlier, just before I was let go. The transfers had been done at below market valuations. The effect, once fully traced, was that the most valuable properties in the Harwick portfolio were being moved out of the main company, the company I could theoretically have had a legal claim to as a long-term employee with documented contributions, and into an entity I had no connection to. Anaya also found something else. During my time at Harwick, I had been listed as a signing officer on several operational accounts. My father had never removed me from those designations. In 2 instances, contracts I had originated and negotiated, one with a property maintenance company, one with a commercial tenant in Brampton, had been formally credited to Brett in internal documentation that had been created after my departure. In other words, my work had been reattributed to someone else, retroactively, after I was no longer there to dispute it. When Anaya laid all of this out on the table, I sat with it for a while. Then I asked her what our options were. She told me. The wrongful dismissal claim was the most straightforward part. I had more than adequate grounds. The severance offer was significantly below what the Employment Standards Act required, given my tenure and the nature of my role. The asset transfer issue was more complex. It involved potential breach of fiduciary duty. It potentially involved CRE implications that were not my problem to pursue, but that Douglas, the accountant, was going to find extremely unpleasant once the right people started looking. And the attribution issue, the recrediting of my contracts to Brett, was something that could be demonstrated with timestamps, email records, and client testimony. The maintenance company I had brought in still had the original communications. The Brampton tenant remembered exactly who had negotiated their lease. We filed. I will not pretend the months that followed were anything other than brutal. My father called me twice during that period. The first time was to tell me I was making a mistake and that he had hoped I was mature enough to handle a business decision professionally. The second time was to tell me that Diane was very hurt and that he had not expected this from me. I let both calls go to voicemail. I listened to them once and then saved them in the same folder as everything else. Brett reached out through Instagram, which felt appropriately absurd. He said he had nothing to do with any of it and that he was sorry if I felt blindsided. I did not respond. My mother knew everything. She sat with me at my kitchen table on multiple evenings when I could not face being alone with my own thoughts. And she made tea and let me talk, and occasionally said things like, "Your father has always confused being calm with being right," which is the most devastating, accurate sentence she has ever produced. In the spring, my father's lawyers made a settlement offer. It was higher than the original severance, higher than I had expected, actually, but it included a non-disclosure clause, a clause releasing Harwick from any further claims, and a clause that required me to withdraw the complaint we had filed with the Ontario Securities Commission regarding the asset transfers. I read it twice. I called Anaya. She said, "It's a reasonable offer financially, but you'd be closing every door." I declined. 2 weeks later, my father's lawyer contacted Anaya to schedule a mediation. We agreed. And the mediation is what brought us all into that courtroom on a Tuesday morning in October, in a building on University Avenue, where the elevator buttons were worn smooth from years of other people's difficult days. I was there when my father arrived. I watched him walk in with his 3 lawyers, and I watched him look at me across the room, and I watched him smile. that particular smile and say what he said about signing the papers when they asked nicely. What he did not know was who else was in that room. There was a woman seated in the gallery whom my father had glanced at once and dismissed. She was in her mid-50s, wearing a dark blazer, her hair pulled back precisely, a leather folio on her lap. Her name is Margaret. She is the managing director of a commercial real estate investment trust based in Calgary, one of the largest private real estate funds in Western Canada. She was there because 6 months earlier, to a series of introductions that Anaya had quietly facilitated, I had entered into a preliminary agreement to consult on a significant acquisition this fund was considering in the GTA market. The properties they were considering acquiring were, in substantial part, the properties that my father had transferred into the numbered holding company at below market valuations. 8 months before their actual market value had increased significantly due to a rezoning decision that had just come through. I had not arranged Margaret's presence for theatre. She was there because she was a material witness to the legitimacy of my valuation assessments. The same valuations my father's lawyers were attempting to argue were inflated and self-interested. But the effect of her being in the room, once it became clear who she was and what she represented, was something I had not entirely anticipated. My father's lead counsel, a man I will call senior partner, because that is all he has ever been to me, had been conducting himself with the particular brand of aggressive condescension that expensive Bay Street lawyers deploy when they believe they are dealing with someone who cannot afford to fight back. He had spent the first 40 minutes of that morning session challenging my documentation, questioning my credibility, and making a point of noting for the record that my educational background did not qualify me to make the assessments I had made. And then Margaret was called to speak. She is not a dramatic person. She does not raise her voice. She answered questions with the measured, factual precision of someone who has been in rooms like this for 30 years and finds most of the people in them mildly tiresome. She confirmed what she knew. She confirmed the provenance of my assessments. She confirmed that her fund had engaged me specifically because my analysis had been independently verified and found to be accurate. Across the room, I watched senior partner's posture change. It was subtle. His pen had been moving constantly during the morning. Notes, annotations, little hierarchies of arguments. It went still. My father was watching Margaret. I do not know what he was thinking. I have spent enough of my life trying to know what my father is thinking. I let it go. What happened next took about 20 minutes. Lawyers spoke in the way lawyers speak when they are recalibrating in real time, careful language, qualified statements, requests for short recesses that lasted longer than the requested time suggested. Anaya was very still beside me. She had the expression she gets when she's thinking 3 steps ahead of everything being said out loud. At one point, during a brief recess, senior partner walked over to Anaya and had a quiet conversation near the window. I watched them without being able to hear anything. Anaya nodded twice. Senior partner walked back to his table. His client, my father, leaned over to say something to him, and senior partner put a hand out in a brief forestalling gesture. My father sat back. That gesture, that small practiced hand that said stop, without apology to a man who had built his entire identity on never being told to stop. That is the moment I will remember. When the recess ended and we resumed, my father's lawyers withdrew the counterclaim they had filed against me, the one that had accused me of misappropriating confidential business information during my time at Harwick. The case settled. The terms are under a confidentiality agreement and I will not detail them here, but I will say that they were substantially different from what had been offered in the spring. My father did not look at me when we left. He walked out ahead of his lawyers, past the gallery where Diane had been sitting, past the worn elevator buttons, and out into the October street. Diane followed him, her camel coat back on. She did not look at me either. Anaya and I stood in the courthouse corridor for a moment after everyone else had filed out. She has a particular way of exhaling when something is finished. Not relief exactly, more like the careful release of something she has been holding in precise alignment for a very long time. Okay, she said. Okay, I said. We went to a Vietnamese restaurant on Spadina that she likes and we ate pho, and she told me about the next case she was working on, and I told her about the contract with Margaret's fund that was moving into its second phase. And at some point I realized I had stopped replaying the morning in my head and was just sitting in a restaurant eating lunch, which felt, in its smallness, like the most significant thing that had happened all day. Margaret sent me a text that evening. It said simply, "Well done today. Looking forward to what comes next." I showed it to my mother when I went to see her that weekend. She read it, handed the phone back, and said, "Good." She made tea. I sat at her kitchen table, the same table where I had sat with my laptop applying for jobs, the same table where she had made tea and pretended not to watch me worry, and I looked at the radiator in the corner, which had been replaced the previous winter and no longer clanked. And I thought about all the years that had accumulated in this kitchen, all the mornings my mother had made do and moved forward and not said the bitter things she had every right to say. My father never called to address what happened in that courtroom. I did not expect him to. He's not the kind of person who circles back. He's the kind of person who keeps moving forward as though forward is the only direction, as though looking back would be some kind of structural failure. I have thought about whether I am angry. I have thought about it a great deal actually in the months since October. The honest answer is less than I expected. What I feel more than anger is something harder to name. A kind of clarity. The sensation of having looked at something directly without the softening effect of hope and finding that you can bear it. I do not think my father is a villain. I think he's a person who decided somewhere along the way that his comfort and his plan mattered more than his obligations, and who got away with that for long enough that he genuinely stopped believing anyone would ever hold him to account. I was not able to make him understand what he had taken from me. I tried in the early years in ways I am now embarrassed by. The overperformance, the resume sent the same night, the 4 years of arriving early and leaving late. I was trying to make him see me. I understand that now. He did not see me. But Margaret did, Anaya did, Vivian, who has since moved to a competitor firm and sent me a message when the settlement was filed saying she had always known, did. My mother, who has always seen me more clearly than I have ever been comfortable with, did. And I see myself now. That is the part I did not anticipate, that all of this would end not with my father finally understanding what he had dismissed, but with me no longer needing him to. The numbered company my father set up has since been the subject of a CRA audit. I did not initiate that. I did not need to. When you move assets at below market valuations in a way that creates certain tax advantages, and then a very prominent commercial real estate fund starts asking questions about the provenance of those assets, certain government bodies tend to develop their own curiosity. Douglas, the accountant, retired unexpectedly in January. Brett, I am told, has returned to the landscaping work. I bear him no particular ill will. He was handed something he did not earn and did not know what to do with, which is its own kind of problem to live with. My father lives in Mississauga with Diane. He has, as far as I know, not acknowledged any of this to anyone in the family. My aunt, my mother's sister, called me in November to say she had spoken to him briefly at a family function and that he had seemed, as she put it, quieter than usual. She said it carefully, the way you say things you want to mean more than they literally say. I have a contract now, a real one, with Margaret's fund, a consulting engagement that is serious and well compensated, and mine, built on work I can document and expertise no one can retroactively reassign. I have an office, a rented one, small, with a window that looks onto an alley in Liberty Village, which is not glamorous, but it is mine in a way that nothing at Harwick ever was. I signed the contract on a Tuesday morning. I used a pen that had belonged to my mother, a simple silver one that she had been given as a gift years ago and never used much because she said she didn't want to run it out. She gave it to me the week I filed the lawsuit. She said, use it for something that matters. I thought about her when I signed. I thought about the kitchen table and the tea and the radiator. I thought about the look on my father's face in that courtroom, not the smile, but the moment just after Margaret finished speaking, when the smile was gone and there was something underneath it that I had never seen on his face before. Not guilt. I do not think it was guilt. It looked, if I am being honest, like the particular disorientation of a person who has spent a very long time in a room they thought they controlled and has just noticed for the first time that someone else has been holding the key.